Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Episode 73. Younger Man, Go East. The title of this episode is, of sorts, a reference to episode 13. My original title for this episode was going to be Young Man, Go West. This was in reference to a popular phrase which Wikipedia tells me is attributed to Horace Greeley in an 1835 article of the New York Daily Tribune. Well, now we've got a descendant of Seleucus I, who that episode title was going to apply to, moving his attention eastwards. I know I didn't stick with the title idea for episode 13, but I still thought it was poetic and a homage of sorts. Anyway, we last left our Seleucid narrative with Antiochus III learning that Zenoitas had been decisively annihilated. Well, while Zenoitas was getting his armies destroyed, Antiochus was bogged down with Egypt. The king had travelled west from Apamea, which was the main base of the army in the Seleucid Empire. He was travelling to invade Hollow Syria. As we said in previous episodes, hostilities with Egypt had broken out at around this time. Not that I think the Seleucid Empire could afford to have conflict on two fronts at this time, but hey, I'm not in charge of Seleucid foreign policy in the 220s BCE. I should clarify that this conflict is not a new Syrian war. We'll get to that in due course. The Seleucid army had travelled to the marshy border between the two empires in a valley called Marsyas. This was located between two sets of mountains, poetically, or satisfyingly enough, called the Lebanon Mountains and the Anti-Lebanon Mountains. There were Egyptian strongholds on both sides of this valley, commanded by a Ptolemaic commander called Theodotus. Yes, this is another Theodotus. On the plus side, this one is Theodotus the Aetolian, totally different from that other minor chess piece called Theodotus we dealt with previously. Anyway, in trying to break through the defences here, Antiochus III got his armies destroyed. You might think that the aftermath of a heavy defeat is just the right time to start infighting again, and you'd be right. Epigenes and Hermias began bickering again. Hermias was getting stymied by the war going badly, and Epigenes had enough evidence on his side that the council was now behind him. It was decided at this juncture that Antiochus should head back and deal with Molon himself. In other words, the strategy that Epigenes had been suggesting all along. You can almost hear him crowing with victory through the microphone, can't you? Hermias realised he couldn't fight this. However, he was determined that Epigenes wouldn't come out of this forthcoming expedition with all the accompanying glory. He knew it would be a challenge to get rid of Epigenes, seeing as he was beloved by the soldiers and he had an ally in the young king himself. However, an opportunity came knocking once the force headed back towards Apamea and began assembling an army to deal with Molon. What with all the strife during the reigns of the last few rulers, the Seleucids didn't have all that much money anymore. Consequently, the soldiers weren't getting paid, and in fact were owed money by the state. As you can imagine, never a good sign. In fact, the soldiery began getting assertive. I can well imagine a nervous Antiochus looking out of the palace window with a jeering mob of soldiers below. Hermias now suggested a solution which Antiochus was supposedly forced to accept, hence my dramatic imagery of impending revolts. The minister generously agreed to cover all the state's debts to the soldiers. And no, there was no catch. Oh wait, maybe one. The price was that Epigenes would not be present with the Eastern campaign. So that's him taken care of then. Epigenes went into retirement, with just 6,000 men from the army staying loyal to him. They would be a thorn in the side of the opposing camp until they were mostly wiped out during a battle in 220. That said, Epigenes continued to be a bogeyman in the mind of Hermias even after he left the political stage. Eventually, Hermias managed to have him killed by accusing him of colluding with Molon and even slipping a fake letter from Molon into the correspondence of Epigenes. If you didn't think Epigenes was dealt with properly before, well, he certainly is now. The Seleucids moved over the Euphrates River in the close of the year 221 BCE. They headed to Mesopotamia and stopped at Nisibis for 6 weeks. There, they waited out the worst of the winter, and then moved on towards the Tigris River in the spring of 220. From here, there were 2 possible options. Who else but Hermias was the advocate of the first, which was to head straight towards Babylon and Molon via the course of the river Tigris. However, the governor of Babylon demonstrated that this plan would be difficult, due to the emptiness of South Mesopotamia and the lack of resources for the army. Added to that, if they made it through, they would come upon a Molon-held series of canals in Babylon which would block them. They would then have to withdraw, with the enemy hassling them and no resources to their name. Instead, Zeuxis wanted to cross to the east bank of the Tigris. This was because the land was rich from Apolloniatis onwards, and he thought they could count on Seleucid supporters living in the region. These supporters had been scared to Molon's side, but Zeuxis hoped that they would betray him. More than that, the prospect of being cut off from his home turf in Media would mean Molon would either have to fight, or risk angering his troops by putting off a conflict. Essentially, this dichotomy seems to be a question of speed versus planning. Hermias relented, and the Seleucids moved across the Tigris and towards the south from there. They encountered Molon's troops besieging Dura in Parapotamia. If you remember from previous episodes in our narrative, this was one of the areas that Molon swallowed up after his victories over Zenoitas and the other regional satraps. The forces of Molon were dispersed, and the Seleucids headed on towards Apolloniatis. It is there, with the Seleucids and Molon now in each other's orbit, that we will leave it for today. As always, thank you all for listening. Feel free to get in touch with the show's email address for any questions, comments, or topic suggestions for future episodes. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.